A very good afternoon to everybody who has joined, and thank you. So today we are conducting the second session of our webinar series titled Brainstorming on Promoting Enterprising Innovation in RGCB. And with us we have today our guest speaker, Dr. Praveen Kumar Vemula, an associate professor from INSTEM, Bangalore. And on behalf of Scientific Coordination Division and the scientists and staff of RGCB, I welcome you to the session, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So, sir will be taking us through a presentation on developing prophylactic and therapeutic biomaterials for unmet clinical needs. So now I invite our director, Professor Chandrabas Narayana, to speak a few words. Acting him.
Okay, Parvati, I was not planning to speak. I had just spoken to Praveen already before all of you came. So, of course, Praveen is a good friend of mine. We have been working together. We have been in a DAC of students in STEM also. And it's a long time association. And by the way, I just wanted to tell all of you that Praveen is part of our committee, which looks at our technological I had formed a committee when I came here, and Praveen is one of the members of our OTV's committee, which looks at all the technologies. So thank you, Praveen, and you have been helping us with that, as well as many a times I have contacted you. Thank you. And as I said earlier, we are looking forward to hearing from you how we can take technology from lab to product. So you are going to enlighten us. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to working with you for a long time. So I'm so looking forward for all the discussions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Go ahead, Parvati, introduce.
Yeah, sure, sir. Now, about our guest speaker for today, Dr. Praveen Kumar Vemula has completed Masters in Chemistry from Osmania University and obtained PhD from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. He received his postdoctoral fellowships from City University of New York and Harvard Medical School. His expertise is in developing chemical techniques for medical applications. His works are spread over in the field of biomaterials, drug delivery, medical devices, and chemical biology. He has published over 70 peer-reviewed papers, has given more than 150 national and international invited lectures, including 2 TEDx talks, and have more than 25 issued or pending national and international patents, which have been licensed to multiple biotech companies. Several technologies developed in his lab have helped in forming the foundation for various products that are either currently in the market or that are under the development stage. His technologies have led to the launch of 5 companies, namely Cepeo Health, which is an anti-pesticide technologies company in India, Artis Therapeutics, a drug discovery company of IBDs in USA, Skintific, a skincare company in France, Alivio Therapeutics, an inflammation targeting company in USA, and Color Threads, a medical textile company which pans around India and USA. 20 products that are developed based on his technologies are now available in the market worldwide. And now let's hear it from the expert himself. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thanks for those kind words. And once again, thank you, Dr. Chandrabas and organizing committee for inviting me to share some of work with this wonderful audience. And good evening, everyone. Today, primarily, I'm going to discuss about how one can develop prophylactic and therapeutic biomaterials for unmet clinical needs. More importantly, we're also equally interested in the not only just developing technologies but translating them into the next stage by practicing entrepreneurship in the lab. So we'll be discussing more about the technical work here, but there are many do's and don'ts which can be important when you're thinking about entrepreneurship that we can discuss during our discussion. So just to give you an overview, like my lab at INSTEM, which is located in Bangalore, as RJCB, INSTEM also is an autonomous institute of DBT. So our lab focused on clinical translational research, where primarily two programs we run in the lab. One is biomaterials, another one is chemical biology program. The biomaterials, what we do is we develop like novel biomaterials and bioengineering principles to improve the efficacy of the existing drugs. But whereas in the chemical biology program, this is the complete classical drug discovery program where we develop new drugs. And the biomaterials could be like a two types. There are like a therapeutic biomaterial as well as the prophylactic biomaterial. As the name suggests, like, this material could be used either to prevent the diseases to occur, or you can use them as a therapeutic material. And the drug discovery program, there are again two types one can develop. One is having this classical medicinal chemistry based small molecular drugs one can discover. And second is developing novel biologics based like enzymes, cytokines, antibodies, peptides, and so on. Based on biologics, one can develop the drugs. The entire work that we carried out in our lab falls into one of these categories. And today, primarily, I'm going to talk most of our examples from our efforts in biomaterials, which we have been doing like past 6-7 years at INSTEM. To begin with, like let's say some of the examples from the therapeutic biomaterials. As a lab, like when we are talking about clinical translational research, one need to focus on developing platform technologies instead of like having that one-off product technologies. Then you will have much better broad opportunity to translate them. That's why we focused on the inflammatory disorders. As you know, inflammation is inherent part of majority of the diseases like arthritis, psoriasis, lupus, and so on. But like despite knowing or availability of very potent anti-inflammatory drugs and immunosuppressant drugs, the overall therapeutic outcome for this material, these diseases are rather poor. That's major reason is like if you see the level of disease or level of inflammation in this disease is highly fluctuated. It never like it comes in steady state and remains there, right? But rather, if you see here, the level of disease is fluctuated manner. You have the increased period of time, you have steady state, and you have remission period, occasional flare-ups, and so on. And unfortunately, we do not have a single non-invasive, reliable method to, measure the level of inflammation a patient has. So because of that, it becomes very tough for a doctor to prescribe what is the doses of drugs need to be given, what is the duration it should be given, and when to give, right? So that's where we thought like, can we develop a novel drug delivery system if you can, which can treat like all the inflammatory disorders, then it will have much broader impact in the healthcare. So then if you go back and see like almost 60-70 years history of the drug delivery, there are so far two major breakthroughs technology have been developed. Very early in the field, developing this small molecule or polymer based excipients, one can take the appropriate excipient and blend with the drugs and dissolve them and solubilize them. By giving these formulations with a single dose, it keeps the drug in a therapeutic window for a certain period of time. When drug concentration goes to subtherapeutic level, give another dose, so on, right? It keeps again in therapeutic dose for a certain period of time. So that's how, doctor tells you whether you have to take a drug for once in a day or twice in a day and so on, right? And this is great for like, if a patient has to take medication for like a few days to a week or so, right? But when you're thinking about the chronic disorders where people have to take drugs for like, several weeks to several months, we tend to miss the doses, right? Either we take like more frequently or completely we miss the doses. Either way, the overall therapeutic outcome would be poor. That's why late 70s and early 80s, people have developed this sustained drug delivery concepts where a plethora of biomaterials were made, where you can encapsulate the drug into these materials, and one giving a single dose, it will release the drugs in a sustained manner for over a period of time. So with this, like with a single dose, you can have much extended period of therapy. So the both way of delivering drugs have revolutionized the way you treat the people, right? But however, if you see in the inflammatory disorders, as I mentioned, if you see the level of disease itself highly fluctuated, and we don't even know how to measure it, it becomes very difficult to design a material which can release the drug according to the level of disease it has, right? So, but this is only possible. The best way to deliver these drugs is the release of the drug should be like, the level of inflammation should decide, right? Like whenever the inflammation is there, they should release the drug. If inflammation is going down, it can reduce the, stop releasing the drug. If it comes back, it should release the drug. So that's why, like, but this is since mechanical, it's almost impossible to sense and release these drugs. This is possible only if disease itself can decide to, and control when to release the drug and how much to release the drug. Then only we can achieve this disease responsive on-demand drug delivery system. So that's the concept what we have been developing in our laboratory. How the concept works is like, first one need to identify a biomarker that is produced during the disease state. So this could be a cytokine, an enzyme, or a peptide, and so on. So in inflammatory diseases, it's a well-studied system. The proteolytic enzymes are the biomarkers, and they're overexpressed during the inflammation. Now you develop a drug delivery system which can encapsulate the drugs efficiently and keep them as a depot. But in the absence of this biomarker, they don't release the drug. But like whenever it comes in contact with this biomarker, that triggers the release of the drug, and the released drugs goes and alleviate the disease, and they stop producing the biomarker, they stop releasing the drug. So in this way, the disease itself gives the feedback loop, right? And it can control when to release the drug, how much to release the drug. So this is the overall concept what we have developed, and I will tell you like how these concepts could be used for multiple medical applications. One is like, protecting transplanted organs and improving the efficacy in the treatment of inflammatory arthritis and IBDs and so on. So when you talk about organ transplantation, right, there are two types. Like one is solid or internal organs, like lung, liver, heart, kidney, and so on. But second class of transplantation is vascularized composite tissue allotransplantation called VCA. So where like, instead of like, one organ, like a full tissue, composite tissue, like, full hand, full face, full leg can be transplanted. In fact, here every color code part of the body is already been very successfully transplanted using microsurgeries. Practically every single part of our body could be transplanted from one person to another, right? And today I'll talk more about the hand transplantation, because now microsurgery has developed so much that people can do this single and double hand transplantation very efficiently, right? And the post-transplantation, in fact, like these patients can, regain their function by using this newly transplanted hands. They can regain their function as well and do their daily chores, which is incredible, right? Like, but the question is everything okay with these patients? So unfortunately, the answer is no, because as you know, like, our immune system is designed, is our friend, is designed to identify a foreign material, is a pathogens or foreign tissue, and reject it, right, and protect from them. And but in these patients, your immune system turns into four, like because your transplanted organ graft and considered as a foreign material, and that's why your body tries to reject it. That's why these patients have to take immunosuppressants systemic every single day throughout their life, and that leads to a severe complication called global immunosuppression, because their entire immune system get compromised, and these patients could be like very vulnerable for any infection. A small infection like a flu can be lethal for these patients. And also, since it's a systemic drug delivery, like many other organs get systemic toxicity. So that's where we thought, developing like, a drug delivery system which can protect the transplanted organ, but without causing the global immunosuppression, will have the great impact in the treatment of these patients. So earlier people tried to do this, having this control and sustained release of the drug delivery systems, but they weren't working well because, as you know, as I mentioned, like, this immune activation and associated inflammation is highly fluctuated, on and off it goes. But this material release the drug irrespective of the disease is there or not. So that's where we thought of developing this on-demand material. Then how you do is, as I mentioned, the immune activation and associated inflammation produces this high concentration of proteolytic enzymes. Then we wanted to develop this enzyme responsive drug delivery systems, which can be degraded by only these enzymes, but when there is no proteolytic enzyme, they should remain stable. So that's the overall concept. And our approach is as the following. Then we design various amphiphilic molecules. These are like, lipid-like structures. By appropriately changing the structure, one can induce a very strong self-assembly to form this self-assembly nanostructure. During the self-assembly process, one can encapsulate the choice of your drug, in this case immunosuppressant, and this robust enough that they don't release the drug in a non-specific manner, but whenever they get in contact with the proteolytic enzyme, they can degrade and release the drug in a responsive manner. That's the overall concept. Then the question is, what kind of molecules one can use? Instead of that, completely synthesizing new molecules whose toxicity we don't know, what we have done is we focused on the molecules called GRAS agents. These are used by variety of food product, cosmetic products in the human, so they're known to be safe. So we screened few hundreds of these molecules and optimize 4 molecules which have the great ability to form the self-assembled structures. One of them is like a triglycerol monostearate. This is like a nice amplified structure. We can, by using appropriate condition, one can induce the self-assembly, and also since it has an ester, this can be degraded by proteolytic enzymes. Then we optimize conditions to form the gels, and we selected the drug called tacrolimus. This is the known immunosuppressant used in the clinic, and we optimize conditions to encapsulate a good quantity of this drug into these injectable hydrogels. Once we have these injectable hydrogels, we tested their ability to release the drug in response to the enzymes. As you can see, in the absence of any enzymes, we have very non-specific 5 to 10% of the release, but after that it stabilizes. In fact, we tested up to 90 days, so you don't see any release. But when you get exposed to the proteolytic enzymes, you can see they can degrade and release the drug in a responsive manner. But again, these are very stabilized in vitro enzymes. Then we wanted to see really inflammatory-like condition can also trigger such release. So for that, what we did is we take the immune cells, but these are rested immune cells, like healthy condition, which represents, and we activate them by treating with the lipopolysaccharide. And these activated macrophages produce proteolytic enzymes, and they resemble your inflammatory-like condition in the body. So when you take the conditioned media from both activated macrophages and then we tested even exposing to non-activated macrophages and saw that release of the drug. When you see that when gels were exposed to the non-activated macrophages conditioned media, the release similar to what we see it in the buffer, right? But whereas when you expose to the activated macrophages, which resembles inflammation-like condition, you can see the release of the drug. And not only that, whenever we give the fresh pulse of this conditioned media, we can see the dose responsive manner release, which is clearly suggesting that this material can respond to the level of inflammation in an on-demand manner to release the drug. So then we went and tested their ability to actually protect the transplanted organ. So for that, what we have done is we did this entire living transplantation from 2 mismatched rats, like from brown Norway rat to Lewis rat. And the post-transplantation, you can stitch them back and take these injectable hydrogels, inject them as a small depots under the skin and measure the survival rate. Just to summarize the results, as you can see, post-transplantation, if you don't give a treatment or give only gel, in that case, within 11 days, animals start rejecting the graft. You can see severe inflammation and grade 1 rejection stops. But as a control, if you take only drug, given the local injections, and in that case also in 33 days, you see the complete rejection where severe muscle damage, tissue damage, and severe inflammation, and a grade 3 rejection we see. Now what you do is take the same amount of drug and encapsulate within the gel and give 1 injection post-transplantation. In such cases, we can clearly see there is no sign of inflammation we see, and hair grows back, animal is pretty healthy, and in fact, it start moving its limb and it regains slowly its function and so on. And we went and tested their entire systemic immune system that is still active. And also we have entire internal systemic organ toxicity. Also, we tested that absolutely no internal organ toxicity occurred. Then we wanted to see how long we can prolong this survival, right? So for example, as I mentioned, if you give a single dose of only drug post-transplantation, the survival is say for 33 days. But when you give the same dose in the gel and give one injection after the surgery, the survival goes to 190 days. And then based on our pharmacokinetics data, then what we have done is if you do the periodic injections, like after 3 months you give one more injection, survival goes to 260 days. So which is clearly suggesting that as long as the animal is alive, this periodic injections can protect the transplanted organ from rejection and without causing any systemic toxicity. In fact, the gold standard in the field today is if you can reach 60 days without rejection with any material, that is a gold standard, and including some of the side effects. But here, like we can indefinitely, you can increase the survival till animal is alive without causing any side effect. That's incredible. So then we wanted to see whether, as today clinical problem, if you see these people get opportunistic infections, right? All the patients, because their entire global immune system is compromised. So we wanted to see whether we can avoid such infections. So for that, we took two group of animals, they transplanted, and one group received these periodic injections, like once in a 70 days, we gave one injection. In other case, we gave the systemic therapy, very small doses of systemic therapy, like every single day, like how the patients take today. And in both cases, the survival of the graft is good, but all the animals that received systemic therapy, they have developed, each of the animal developed the opportunistic infections, but whereas none of the animals that received or disease response to localized delivery, they haven't developed any infection at all, which is clearly suggesting the robustness of this technology to prevent the global immunosuppression and still protect the transplanted organs. So after that, like we went and demonstrated the same efficacy in the larger animals as well. Now we are working with some of the clinicians to optimize further to take to the clinic. With that, it comes to the second example, like where how this could be used for for the better treatment of arthritis. As arthritis is primarily affects your joints, right? And the people have to take this very potent drug, like Vax and Bextra and all, large doses in order to have the efficacy at the joints. But because of these large doses, they have severe systemic toxicity. And because of this systemic toxicity outweighs their benefits, and FDA recall from the market, drugs like Vax and Bextra. Okay, so that's why what people have started doing is taking these drugs and directly injecting at the site of the inflammation, like in the joints, through intra-articular injections. But unfortunately, it wasn't very effective because when you inject them, these are solubilized drugs, right? They can easily disperse from there and diffuse and goes out of the site of injection. And there are a series of drugs have been tried to inject in this manner, but if you see the average 10 minutes to 5 hours maximum, they stay at the site of injection, they disperse. Okay, but according to protocol, you can do only 2 injections per year. Otherwise, we end up damage the tissue itself or the knee itself. So that's why what people have started doing is encapsulating these drugs into a variety of biomaterial, nanoparticle, microparticle, hydrogels, and liposomes, and so on. But again, as I mentioned, irrespective of your arthritis inflammation is there or not, because it's highly fluctuation, right? Once you inject this material continuously, they release the drugs few days to few weeks, and they disperse. So that's why the overall therapeutic outcome is very poor. That's where we thought, can we use our inflammation responsive material, which will not release the drug when there is no inflammation, but whenever it comes, they should release the drug, right? So, and for that, what we have done is we took the triamcinolone acetonide drug, which is like a clinically prescribed drug for arthritis, and again we optimized conditions to develop these injectable hydrogels, and we tested that this drug also released in response to the proteolytic enzymes and inflammation, as mentioned earlier. But more importantly, we wanted to see, because when you have arthritis patient, their knees and all, in the knee joints, you have this synovial fluid and it becomes completely inflamed synovial fluid, right? We wanted to see such inflamed synovial fluid can induce the release of the drug. To test that, we collected the synovial fluid from arthritis patients as well as a healthy volunteers. Healthy synovial fluid also was taken from the healthy volunteers and exposed these gels and see how the release is. In that case, if you see this yellow line where the synovial fluid collected from the healthy people, like when they're exposed to gels, the release is not much different than the buffer, which is like underline the black line, right? But whereas when you expose these gels to the synovial fluid that was collected from the arthritis patients, we can see the release of the drug much higher, right? Which is clearly suggesting that indeed, when you have the inflammation, inflamed synovial fluid can actually release the drug in an on-demand manner, right? So then after proving that, the more important point we wanted to see, if there is no inflammation, can these gels can remain where you inject them without releasing the drug, but whenever inflammation comes back, can they release the drug? Okay. To test that, what we have done is we fluorescently labeled gels was taken. The dyes were encapsulated into these gels and injected into the healthy animal joints. Okay, then we measured the level of fluorescence over a period of time, even a couple of weeks. You don't see the disappearance of these gels. So they remain where they were injected. And even despite of this mechanical movement, because these animals are running around and walking around, right? So despite of that, they remain there. They don't release the drug. But one can induce the arthritis in these animals by injecting KBXN serum. So when you inject like about 37.5 microliters and it start developing mild arthritis from day 6. Okay, so when you inject them, we can see after day 6 a slowly disappearance of the signal, right? And then what you can do is if you double the dose of serum, like say 75 microliters, if you inject them, and it generates the severe arthritis in day 2 onwards. Okay, so when you injected them, like you can see right after 2 days, a rapid dissolution of the gels and release the drug. So which clearly suggesting that these gels have the ability to remain stable without releasing the drug if there is no inflammation. But whenever the disease comes, in on-demand manner, they can release the drug and to reduce the inflammation. So once we have that, we went and tested the overall therapeutic outcome. As you can see here, once we developed the arthritis by injecting KBXN serum, either same dose of free drug was injected or the same dose were encapsulated into the gel and injected. And if you measure the overall therapeutic outcome, one way to measure is the swellingness. The less swelling is the better output, right? So you can see when you encapsulated into these gels, and you have much better therapeutic outcome compared to when you inject it into free tacrolimus, free drug. Okay, same manner when you measure the overall clinical score based on the pathology, also you see much better therapeutic outcome here. So which is clearly suggesting that when you have this inflammation responsive material, we'll have much better therapeutic outcome with the treatment of arthritis. That brings us to your third example, like where what we have done is not only inflammation responsive, but like now we added another layer of design, that is inflammation targeting material. And I'll show you like how this could be used for the treatment of IBDs. As you know, IBDs comes in two variants, right? Like Crohn's disease and colitis, and where your small intestine, large intestines gets affected, you have the patches of inflammation throughout the intestine, right? Unfortunately, today, if you take any drugs, oral pills, your healthy tissue also get the same dose compared to your ulcerated tissue. So because of that, healthy tissue have severe side effects. That's why like many drugs like they don't work, because unfortunately like these drug side effects is if you get to the healthy tissue, it causes inflammation. So that means like you're basically turning bad tissue into good and good tissue into bad. So because of that, you don't see the overall therapeutic outcome. So the best way of treating delivery systems is you should be able to deliver the drugs to only site of inflammation, but not healthy tissue. How this could be possible is, for example, like if you have a material which can be stable in GI tract, it shouldn't interact with your healthy tissue. but wherever the inflammation is there, it should go and specifically like a glue, it should bind to only and release the drug in a localized manner. So then we will have the much better therapeutic outcome. The question is how one can design a material which can have this such a specific adherence to the only inflamed tissue, right? But if you see the disease balance, right, when the inflammation occurs, ulceration occurs in the tissue, as a defense mechanism, our body produces this large quantities of antibacterial peptides and bactericidal protein when we infect, right? So that means all these peptides and cationic protein, these are completely cationic. So because of that, your ulcerated tissue becomes like a cation charged bed, whereas your healthy mucus is a neutral or negative, right? So then we thought instead of going for any ligands and so on, can we use a simple anionic cationic interactions to induce the adherence? That means we have a particles with a negative surface charge, they don't interact with healthy tissue, but wherever you have this cationic peptides accumulation, they will go and bind there and release the drug to the only ulcerated tissue. That's the overall concept of what we have been developing. Again, we take small molecules and we induce the self-assembly, and where you can encapsulate the drug dexamethasone, which is clinically prescribed drug for IBDs. But these amplifiers also should have the negative charge so that like when they self-assemble and form this nanostructure, micron structure, they will render the negative surface charge, right? And again, they should be able to release the drug in response to the enzymes. So by putting all these parameters together, we optimized ascorbyl palmitate as one of the amplifiers, which can self-assemble and form these structures, but also it can render the negative surface charge to the particles that is assembled. And we optimize all the conditions to develop these hydrogel based micron fibers, and you can see all these fibers have the negative surface charge either with without drug and dyes and so on. Then after that, again, we have shown their ability to release the drug in response to the inflammation and so on. And then we wanted to see whether these material have the ability to adhere to the proteins that are overexpressed at the site of inflammation. Okay, and the transferrin overexpressed at the site of inflammation, that transferrin was coated on these plates. As a control, you take the mucin, which overexpressed at the healthy mucus, and these particles were dye-labeled, fluorescent dye-labeled, and incubated with these plates and washed and measured. As you can see, all these fibers are able to bind to the transferrin, but which is logical, right? Like because you have a cationic protein and you have anionic particles, they induce adherence. So the question is, can we get such a precise, precision, enhanced adherence inside the body, okay, under in vivo conditions? So to test that, what we have done is take the animal and give them dextran sodium sulfate for 7 days, and then it forms a colitis, okay, and your colon becomes like inflamed. Then these particles were given. After these particles were given, and these are fluorescently labeled particle, after 24 hours, surgically we can remove the colons out and see how much fibers these are attached, okay. If you see here in the control colon, these are from each animal a different colon. All the animals that were don't have the colitis, you don't see any sign of fluorescent signal. That means like all the fibers are excreted out through fecals because we have high bowel movement, right? And we are imaging after 24 hours. So it is completely washed away. But whereas all the animals that have the colitis, you can see large amount of fibers are like wherever you see the patches of inflammation, they bind there. And this is even despite of this high fecal movement, and still it remains stable there even after 24 hours, which is clearly suggesting that indeed this material has the ability to go and adhere to the site of inflammation and release the drug. So then we wanted to see the overall therapeutic outcome is how it is. Then again, after inducing the colitis, we gave the either free drug or encapsulating into these gels, these fibers. As you can see, the overall based on histopathology, we have much better therapeutic outcome when you deliver through this targeting material. But the question is, although you could see this adherence, specific adherence to ulcerated tissue in mice, whether can we have such a specific adherence in human tissue as well? So to test that, what we have done is we did the colonoscopy to colitis patients, And by using colonoscopy, we have collected the tissue from the patients from two sides. Okay, from the same patient, we have collected tissue where they have the ulcers, and also in healthy tissue also are taken and ex vivo incubated with these fibers and washed away to see the adherence. As you can see, all the normal tissue don't have much specific adherence, but whereas all the inflamed tissue can bind to these fibers extensively. And not only that, if you measure with the individual patients, for example, one patient, the normal tissue had X amount of adherence, same patient like with the inflamed tissue has much higher, and which is true for every single patient we tested. So, which is clearly suggesting that this material has the ability to go and bind to this ulcerated tissue in a specific manner to release the drug, and so we might able to have much better therapeutic outcome for treating IBDs by using this material. So these are some of the examples of our effort in therapeutic biomaterials, and I'll give quickly one more example, like where we have developed the materials to prevent the diseases to occur. Especially like we have been developing prophylactic materials to protect farmers from pesticide-induced toxicity and mortality. As you know, pesticides are neurotoxins and they are designed to kill pests, right? How they do is like, as you know, like we have this acetylcholinesterase enzyme, which plays major role in our neuromuscular function by controlling the concentration of acetylcholine at the site of at synapse, right? Because all your voluntary signals are controlled by maintaining the concentration of this acetylcholine. But what these pesticides are designed is, and these pesticides can go and covalently bind to this acetylcholinesterase, because you have serine 203, serine inactive site of acetylcholinesterase, where this can go and bind and phosphorylate this enzyme. So because of that, it's irreversible manner, it inhibits this enzyme activity. So when you have this quantitative inhibition, that leads to the paralysis and subsequently death of the pest, right? So, but unfortunately, these chemicals do not discriminate between human and pests, because we do have same enzyme, same function it has. So when people get exposed to the pesticide, we have similar side effects what we see in the pests. So just to give an idea about, like, where if you take the farmers today in India and developing countries, they spray pesticide by using these motorized pumps, and like, large quantity they spray, and it almost like walks under the poisonous rain, right? And it just falls out their skin, and like, they get exposed to through dermal route and inhalation route extensively. So it can cause severe toxicity. But in the literature, if you see, like, it's a very contradictory observations people have reported, because people say, like, people have to get exposed to several years to even to see some symptoms to have the chronic toxicity, which we just couldn't comprehend, because these are such a highly neurotoxins. Upon exposure to such toxins, how one cannot have the side effects. So to understand the ground reality, what we have done is, like, we went and launched a survey in Telangana state. We visited 60 villages, spent almost 8 months, and visited 200 farmers' field. Each one went timed in such a way that they were spraying the pesticides, and to understand what kind of pesticide they use, and do they use any protective measures, and what is the level of exposure they have, and do they have any side effects, and so on. I think that is one of the best decisions we have made. It was like a really eye-opener for us, because forget about the chronic toxicity, right? Even acute toxicity, that same day when they expose, they have severe symptoms, like including vomiting, fever, diarrhea, muscle contraction, breathing disorder, and high doses, it can lead to the convulsions and tremors and so on. Just to give an example, like, just in one district from Maharashtra, in one season, several people, more than 60 people have died, and thousands of hospitalized while getting exposed to the pesticide while spraying into the cotton field. That shows the level of problem that exists and the absence of technologies to protect them. So that's where we decided, we thought, like, develop the technology to protect these farmers from pesticide exposure. So as I mentioned, these pesticides, they're highly skin penetratable, right? Like as soon as it falls on skin, it just goes in and goes and inhibit this enzyme. So we wanted to develop a dermal gel which can apply like a dermal cream, but the physical barriers they don't work because they are super penetratable. So that's where we thought of developing a chemical gel, like this is like a chemical scissor which can covalently react with the pesticide and break down into products which can no longer inhibit the enzyme, right? So then in that way we can protect the prevent from the pesticide-induced toxicity. So, but if you see all the structures, right, all the organophosphates or carbamates or pyrethrin, these all are activated esters. That's how they have the good reactivity towards the enzyme. So then we thought like, if you can break down the esters into acids, then it can no longer cause the toxicity. So then we use this classical nucleophile mediated hydrolysis reaction to deactivate this pesticide. And for that, like instead of a simple nucleophile, we focused on alpha nucleophiles. As you know, like alpha nucleophiles are like much better, superior nucleophiles than your regular nucleophiles, because when you have alpha atom, lone pair on the alpha atom increases the nucleophilicity of the nucleophile, right? So based on alpha nucleophile, there are several categories of alpha nucleophiles are there. One of them are oxime. So we focused on oxime-based nucleophiles. Just cut short, like we have developed an oxime and which was coupled to a protein because polymer, because small molecule oximes they can penetrate through the skin. We want to have a polymer which can form the gel and sit there on the skin to react with the pesticide. So once we have this polymer-based oxime-based polymer catalyst that can deactivate pesticides and regenerate itself to keep deactivating the pesticides. This is a simple synthetic route, like take the pyridinol oxime prepared and coupled with the chitosan, and by using appropriate emollients, like one can form this oxime gel. But as a control, we have taken only chitosan, and without attaching into your reactive oxime, we made a control gel to check whether there is a physical barrier actually or the chemical deactivation. So once we have gels, we went and tested their ability to prevent the pesticide induced inhibition of this ACHE. Then we took the blood from the rats and put it in this transdiffusion bottom chamber where you have the ACH, and this MPT is methyl parathione, and a pesticide was added on the top. And here, like either directly it was exposed or you kept your regular gel or active gel. And if you measure the level of enzyme activity without pesticide exposure, if it is as 100%, when you expose to the pesticide either directly or control gel, you can see the significant drop of enzyme activity. But whereas through polyoxime gel, you don't see any drop of enzyme activity, which is suggesting that indeed this oxime gel is able to deactivate before it penetrates or passing through a gel, so that it can completely prevent the pesticide induced inhibition of ACH. Once we have this ex vivo, we also tested their in vivo ability to reduce this pesticide exposure. For that, 3 group of animals were exposed to the pesticide, same dose of the pesticide. They were directly sprayed or through control gel or with the oxime gel. And after that, you collect the blood and measure the enzyme activity inside the body. Then, as you can see, when you directly exposed or the control gel, a significant drop of enzyme activity was observed in the blood. But whereas when you have the polyoxime gel, you don't see such a drop. And not only in the blood, but we also tested it internal organs. For example, if you take a brain, where you have maximum ACHE, and you can see direct exposure and control gel exposure caused a severe damage or decrease in the enzyme activity, but whereas polyoxime gel completely prevented. And it's not only in the brain, but in every single organ we tested it the same, right? Then after that, like we wanted to see, because farmers, they keep getting exposed, right? They get repeated exposure, and somebody does in like, half an hour farming, somebody does 3 hours farming, somebody does several hours farming. So they get different doses of exposure and repeatedly. So we wanted to see whether we can prevent toxicity even such a repeated dose. So for that, what we have done is like a 3 group of animals again exposed every single day to this pesticide for 4 days, either directly or through control gel or polyoxime gel. But here what we have done is when you use the gel, only day 1 like or day 0, before pesticide, we applied one layer of the gel, and on the same gel every single day we keep exposing the pesticides. In that case, if you see all the animals that receive the pesticide either directly through control gel, all of them they die within 6 days, 100% death what you see. But the animals that received even every repeated dose with a single dose of your polyoxime gel, 100% of the animals remain alive. They don't, you don't see any lethality. And again, when you measure the enzyme activity drop, you can see direct exposure or the through enzyme a severe drop of the enzyme activity. But whereas in the polyoxime gel completely prevented, which is showing the robustness of the gel to prevent the pesticide-induced, lethality. But as you know, once it enters into the body, this pesticide can cause severe damage to our neuronal system. So we wanted to see whether we can prevent such neuronal damage. For that, one way to measure it is quantifying the sciatic nerve damage. What we do is take the animal, apply the dye into all the different arms and make it walk on this mesh. Then after it walks on the mesh, one can measure the angle it took the step and the force they insert and so on. We can put all these numbers into one. There is a complicated equation is there, but with that what we can get is the number called sciatic functional index, SFI. Typically, if there is no neuronal damage in a healthy animals, this number always comes between +11 to -11. Okay, and anything this number goes below 25 considered as a severe neuronal damage. Okay, so when you take these animals, if you healthy animals, if you measure when never got exposed, they all of them remain in the safe zone. But where if a single dose of pesticide when directly exposed, you can see the severe damage of internal neuronal system. But whereas the same dose exposed through our polyoxime gel, all of them remain into safe zone. That which is clearly suggesting that when you have these gels, they can completely prevent any neuronal damage that can occur in situ. And again, one more thing is as I mentioned, acetylcholinesterase deactivate or hydrolyze acetylcholine at the synapse. That's how it terminates your voluntary signals. But if the enzyme gets inhibited, then you see the accumulation of this acetylcholine that leads to the involuntary signaling. So we wanted to measure that. For example, if we take a healthy person and electromyogram, you can measure the neuronal activity. This person is never got exposed to pesticide, you can see, and they are not moving any muscles, so there is no active signaling. That's why you see almost silent, right? But same thing if you measure to a farmer who just finished the farming, okay, and you can see all neurons are firing, okay, which is clearly suggesting that indeed the enzyme inhibition occurred that causes the involuntary signaling. That's how when people get exposed, they have these tremors and so on. This is actually one of the farmer who got who can move his fingers completely uncontrollable manner. So we wanted to see whether we can prevent such involuntary signaling. Okay, so in the mice when you take, sorry, in the rats when we take and you can measure the electromyogram signals here. When you don't expose any pesticide, you don't see any signal because this is under anesthesia. It's not moving any muscles. But when you get a single dose exposure to the pesticide directly, you can see these animals start firing the signal, even they are not causing any voluntary signals. But the same dose when you expose through oxime gel, you see a complete silence of the signal, which is clearly suggesting the ability of these gels to prevent any pesticide exposure. And the same phenomena you will find even when the animal is awake, because when they get exposed to it, now we have voluntary involvement because it feels the stress and it start moving muscles also. That's why you see this firing of neurons. So which can completely prevented by using this pesticide gel. So just to summarize, we could able to develop this topical gel which could be applied on the skin, which can prevent completely all the pesticide exposure and pesticide-induced toxicity and lethality. Because our motto is to protect every single farmer in developing countries, including in India, from this pesticide-induced lethality. So with that, I'll take just 2 minutes for a last example. To show how this prophylactic technology could be used for current scenario. So we have been developing this germicidal antiviral mask for protecting from viral infections because, when the pandemic has started, like we have been thinking like, what way we can, contribute to, control or like, to keep people safe from these infections. And as you know, like once pandemic started, wearing mask and all, it's inevitable and it is now. But like, if you see all the masks like which are currently available, like a typical N95 mask and surgical mask and cloth mask, these are designed to be best filtration devices, right? Because they filter out all the bacteria and virus. They don't allow them going inside to expose, right? So, but there are clinical studies clearly shown that all these bacteria virus can accumulate on the surface of this cloth, and it can remain active for 7 days, which means when we touch while removing or adjusting, one can potentially get exposed to it, right? So that's why we thought like, can we develop a fabric which not only act as a filtration device, but as soon as it comes in contact, it should be able to deactivate and kill the virus and bacteria so that we can prevent the accumulation of any live germs on the this cloth. So just to test that, what we have done is this is a typical agar plate assay where if you don't have bacteria, this is how clean your agar plate looks. But when you see the bacteria and you see the bacterial growth, it becomes completely opaque, right? So what we've done is we asked people to wear this cloth mask, surgical mask, and N95 mask for 6 hours. After that, this mask was taken and touched for a minute on this clean plate and allow the any bacteria, fly bacteria there to grow it. And as you can see, all these cloth masks have the severe amount of live bacteria. You can clearly see, right? So which is clearly suggesting that indeed this material can harvest, act as, reservoir for all the live germs, right? So that's where then we thought of developing this germicidal fabric material, and we quickly developed this germicidal based molecule. These are quaternary ammonium salt based molecule. These are specially designed to interact with the membrane, and these molecules can covalently attach to the fabric, and now this fabric can be stitched into any form, right? Like either mask or gloves or PPEs and your regular apparels like hoodies and t-shirts and so on. So these molecules, what they do is any virus and bacteria comes in contact, they efficiently penetrate into their membrane and rupture it. That's how they kill all the bacteria and virus. Right? So just to test that, and as I mentioned, regular cloth can lead to the harvesting the live bacteria, right? Same manner, the masks that were generated from this germicidal fabric were given to people, and they wore 6 hours, and even we asked them to wear 18 hours. After that, again we do the same assay, and you can see no accumulation of any live germs. Okay, this is as good as clean plate, which is clearly suggesting that indeed this material has the ability to deactivate any bacteria and virus comes in contact. So after showing that, in fact, we during this severe pandemic conditions, we seek the help from RGCB. They have set up the facility. We can validate all antiviral material that have been developed, and with a tremendous help from Dr. Nadakrishnan and Dr. Dayaka, we could able to show that indeed this fabric could able to deactivate all the envelope viruses, including SARS-CoV-2, which is causing our current pandemic, and other influenza viruses and so on. So in fact, we're grateful for them to helping us in that scenario. After that, we went and commercialized this product later. So just to summarize entire thing, as I mentioned, in a therapeutic biomaterial, we have shown that this disease responsive material could be used for treatment of arthritis and IBDs and protect the transplanted organ. In the prophylactic biomaterials, we could be able to develop the materials to prevent the pesticide exposure. In fact, today I really didn't have a chance to talk about our medicinal chemistry efforts, where we have been, in fact, we have developed these small molecular based new chemical entities, which are very efficient to not only just treating, but it can cure the inflammatory diseases like colitis and Crohn's disease in animal models. And but this is, as I mentioned earlier, we are also equally interested in taking these technologies further. And this is the classical depiction of valley of death that existing in any clinical translational research. Because it's irony that like majority of the scientific innovation, all the breakthrough technologies, they remain shelved in the laboratory. They are not able to cross this valley of death to reach to the people, the final. Because however, this gap can be bridged. And if you want to take this breakthrough science, innovation, and convert them into a viable technology by doing further development and reach to the people, one has to practice very efficient entrepreneurship program. One has to set it up. So, and our lab is equally interested in such effort. And what we do is like there are two ways we do, like depend upon the technology. Either we find a existing industrial partner and we license the patents and we co-develop with them, or depend upon if it is the much bigger technology, we can even go and form the startup companies and transfer the technology to further develop to take the clinic. Just to give an example, based on our entire effort on therapeutic biomaterials that I mentioned, we formed a company called Alivio Therapeutics in Boston. It's now it is 5 years old company now. We finished all the safety and tox studies, and in fact, the files have been already applications have been filed with the US FDA for the clinical trials, and we just made a merge deal with a big pharma to take the clinical trials. And based on our anti-pesticide technology, we formed another startup company in Bangalore. It's called Sepio Health. And in fact, we're supposed to start our clinical trials based on this technology in 2021, but due to pandemic, 1 year delayed. It happened probably but next year we'll be starting clinical trials on this anti-pesticide technology in Chikbalapur, where our cohort of farmers are agreed to participate in this. And last year, again, once we developed this germicidal fabric technology, it formed a startup company in Tirupur, where our technology will be has been licensed to the color threads and further developed and commercialized. And not only color threads itself commercialized, but they also partnered with Aditya Birla company Van Heusen, and through that as another commercial partner, it has been launched, and not only just masks travel hoodies and so on, gym wear, travel wear, t-shirts and all have been launched. And again, I didn't have a chance to talk about our chemical biology effort, but based on our anti-inflammatory drugs for colitis, we formed another startup company 2 years back in Boston. And again, all the IND enabling studies are being progressed there. Our target is maybe 2022, most probably we'll be going for the phase 1 clinical trials. So the thing is if you were thinking about these startup companies or translating the technology, one need really another different skill set other than conventional research training what we have been trained for. So which requires again extra effort, extra time, and so on. So the question is why we wanted to push ourselves to go into that route is if you measure the impact of this translational research, it's not only just provides your publications and the patents, but through these ventures, one can create jobs, right? If we have more than 100 jobs have created through these companies, and also it creates wealth. Cumulative, it's almost more than 2,500 crores wealth it has created. Now that can be reinvested into these companies to develop more knowledge. So, and more importantly, apart from all this, the primary motivation for any clinical translation science is to improve the quality of lives of people, because the technology what we developed in the laboratory that reaches to the people and people using and feeling safe is the best feeling one can have. I think those are the moments inspires for any clinical translation scientist to take that extra step and practice entrepreneurship and take to the market. So with that, I would like to stop here and In fact, these are the wonderful group of people like, master student, PhDs and postdocs who did this entire work based on different platform technologies. And I would like to thank all of them. Because of their efforts, all this technology could be developed. And I would like to thank all our collaborators in India and elsewhere. It's a phenomenal help and learning experience working with them. And I would like to thank all our funding sources for their generous funding, which enabled us to do the here. And with that, I would like to thank all of you for your kind attention. I'd be happy to discuss, if you have any questions. I think if you want to talk more about science entrepreneurship, some of the do's and don'ts, I'm happy to discuss in detail. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. That was a very informative presentation, which was packed with a lot of information. So now we'll move on to the interactive session. So if anybody has any questions to ask, or if they want to clarify something, they can utilize this time.
Excuse me, am I audible?
Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. So I'm just Kirat, I'm a master's student. I had a question that when you were testing the pesticides effects and you saw that they can cause neurological defects and all of that in farmers. And I think you must be aware that farmers suffer from a lot of suicide rates and alcoholism. So is it possible that because those also in some recent evidence has shown that they're also neurologically related disorders. So can that also be correlated to the pesticide use?
Yeah, absolutely. There are two things, right? One is your occupational hazard in the sense while doing farming, because the lack of technology, they are getting exposed even if they don't want to, right? And that's the one leads to huge toxicity. And this is the technologies we are trying to develop so that this unwanted exposure can be completely prevented, which can keep them safe. But the second point, as you mentioned, farmer suicide, and especially by consuming pesticide is huge issue, because one of the reason is this is easily available and accessible poison, which every household has. And upon a consumption of this, right now, absolutely there is no effective therapy is available. People only most effective way is if you can find them as soon as they consume, within an hour or so, if they can move to the clinic and do the entire gastric wash and all, if we do, and then using other antidotes like atropine and enzymes, one can reduce the fatality, but that is very thin chances what people have, because by the time people found this, people who consume pesticide itself is late, and it's that's why we have huge fatality rates. So in fact, that is one of the area we are working as well to see whether we can develop a potential drug or effective antidote which can even protect people who consume these pesticides for the suicide reasons. So that's, in fact, that is the one we just initiated. Hopefully, maybe in a year or two, I will be able to give some good news if it works. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Praveen.
Sure.
Yeah, Vinod.
I will.
It's a very nice talk regarding this biomaterial and application. And we are also working that biomaterial related area. Okay. So I have one doubt regarding only you say that especially that in inflammation responsive gel. Okay. So actually, if we have developed something as based on this inflammation responsive gel, what are the exact novelty we required? If you compare with the existing system, how long have to be delivered the thing from the site?
Yeah. So see, one of the thing is since it is inflammation responsive, the timing is something we don't know, because it can vary from patient to patient. and each patient has like different level of inflammation they experience, and because of that, the degradation in response to this inflammation would vary from patient to patient. Okay, and that's where one of the critical question comes is like then how do we know how frequently one should inject, administer these ones, right?
Yeah.
So that's where what we are doing is for the clinical formulation, we are loading these gels with not only just drugs, but also a fluorescent dye, okay, which could be like a non-invasive manner, just topically you can just image to see how much your injected gel depots will remain, okay, just by like thermal either IR imaging
Responsive
you
gel.
can do,
Yeah.
topical imaging and see. So whenever you see the depletion of the depot, then one can be re-injected.
Okay.
So that's it. But if you don't have any inflammation and all, we have seen up to 3 months very stable gels. The depot remains at the same.
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's a good thing because collaboration with Robert Ranger at MIT. So their wonderful work regarding that adhesive bandage. Okay, you know about it, I think.
That's right. Yeah.
So yeah. So second thing is that if you something have to be targeted to bowel disease, generally we have to bypass this acidic pH stomach. Okay. So what are the exact things we have? Because any acidic based things, if you coat or something, it can bypass this acidic pH. Okay. What's the exact thing you used in that system for reaching that bowel or industry? Yeah.
Okay. So the example what today I presented uh, is like they are acid sensitive in the sense pH sensitive.
Yeah.
Okay. So these were given only through enemas. Okay.
Yeah.
Not with the oral route because we wanted to have this proteolytic enzyme responsive. That's why like we gave to the enemas.
Yeah.
So, but like now recently we have made oral formulations. So
Okay.
these are the particles again like encapsulated with the gels, but they are completely stable in stomach and
Yeah.
your intestine in presence of like extremely like low pHs and your digestive enzymes. It still withstands, but your surface charge in such a way that it can still bypass all that and goes and binds to the inflamed tissue. So that we have already developed. In fact, like it's being communicated now that. So those oral formulations also have been developed by using the same concept.
Okay. So that we are also working that especially that peptide, the self-aggregation peptides also. So, well, frankly, I'm asking exactly if you develop something in laboratory prototype system, how you move to from lab to if you have a patent or provisional or complete specification patent, how you move from laboratory to company directly? What are the steps you have to face? Because you
Yeah,
are experienced person.
yeah. So there are multiple factors influence, which route you have to take. So the four more important thing is like, we need to see based on the technology what we develop, how strong IP it
Yeah.
can generate. Okay, because you see conceptually, like we can develop many systems which can be like published and have the better results than what we have today. But conceptually, whether it is the innovation is truly novel, there was no prior art related to that. Whether you have strong a platform like patent availability is there or not. That is the main important thing one need to see.
Okay.
In fact, one should check that even before you start your work. Like idea level itself, one should check that to see whether that is, if you assume everything works, whether that is patentable or not. Okay, so that is one thing. Like, so imagine if all that works, you have a strong patent. Then the second decision one need to see is whether it is a single product like technology or is a platform technology. Okay, and because there are two ways to commercialize. One is like once you have the patents, then either you go and find a already established industry and try to license them. Then they can develop further and bring to the market. or whether you want to go and start your own company and transfer your IP into the company and develop further, right? So both of them are fine. But the decision one need to see is like what is the level of technology you have. Say another term is called, say whether it's industry ready technology we developed or not. Okay, and how much de-risking needs to be done, because you see most of the time, like once we develop, we quickly do investor studies and show in one disease model, efficacy model, it works. But that is, I would say, it's only like 10 to 20% of the work compared to anything else. Then one need to completely de-risk that work, and because even if you go to license to a company, they see efficacy is just one part, but like your entire other feasibility, freedom to operate, safety, and toxicity, this entire things has to be optimized. Then only it can go to the next level. So once you're ready, that then you need to see whether once you make the decision, okay, if it is licensing is a easy thing, right? Like you can work with the technology transfer office and they can take care of it, and you can work with them, license it. But if you want to go for the company, that's where then one need to start. We need to find a best team, the partner team, because if we are academic scientists, then full time might not go as an entrepreneur, right? Like we try to, if you still want to remain in academic and still do this, then we need to find a partner who can co-found a company with, and we can do the day-to-day operations. So you need to find a really reliable people, and also who also have the same passion as you on these technologies to take the further. And at the simultaneously, then you have one need to hunt for the funding. So then this funding, again, like there are two ways it can go. Like one is you can go for like grants, like government grants, like BIRAC grants. There are many BIRAC grants are there, which is like non-dilutive funding. One can especially initial stage, it might help a lot. But generally non-dilutive grants and all, they are pretty time taking. Because it takes its own time and there's no guarantee and all that. Other one is like finding angel investors, private investors and all, where you raise the money in the by giving the equity of the company. So, and those are very mechanisms are there, and depend upon the strong technology you have, one can negotiate the based on equity and all. So those are the immediate steps one need to.
And the last thing, regarding you mentioned about this different coating system for this mask. So I think this super hydrophobic coating also fine little bit, right? Super hydrophobic coating on this metal, especially copper or something. This type of coating technology, number of things already in market or some in patented also. Okay.
Yeah. So hydrophobic coating, one of the thing is like it can again prevent exposure, but it doesn't kill it. So that's why there are many people have started like for killing the germs upon the contact rather than just like filter. Okay. So there have been efforts like metal based, metal ion based ones and other people have been
copper.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Very nice discussion. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, sir.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I have one question. What will be the half-life of biomaterial, and it will create any toxicity to cells?
So that is very broad question, right? You see, every material, some point, like depend upon composition, concentration, it will have some toxicity. So one need to optimize that. That's where like we need to see what is your operating composition. With that, whether we have the toxicity or not. So one of the reason I mentioned when we wanted to take the small molecules which can form self-assembly structure. If I'm an organic chemist, I could have easily go and like design our own molecules and like make really complex molecules, completely super interesting molecules. But we don't know what kind of toxicity they would have, elicit in the later stage. Then we would have spent a lot of time in proving that these molecules are safe and that they are non-toxic and so on. That's one of the things. If you were thinking about translation, one need to keep these things in mind. So because of that, what we have done is we try to identify the molecules which can fit all our criteria, but it's already been studied for their toxicity and the safety studies. So because of that, we could able to avoid spending a lot of time and millions of dollars to proving that they are safe, safe, right? So in a short form, one is like if we develop any material, it is going to have. So one need to test that and see within whatever the composition you are using for your particular application, whether it has or not. That needs to be.
Okay, sir. And second question, sir, like how many numbers of animal used in each group that therapeutic biomaterial you used, sir?
It depend again. You have to do the power calculations and all to see how many numbers of animals is required to get the significant data. And you see, some cases you need like 5 to 6 animal in each group enough to give the significant data. But in some cases, like for example, where you have the therapeutic window very small, in such cases, if you're doing like a survival and all, you might need like 15 animals per group. Okay, so that's why like for each experiment, depend upon what is the experimental design, one need to do the power calculation to arrive at how many numbers are required for that particular experiment. So there is no simple rule that okay, you need to have this many number. Sometimes you can get with n equal to 4, you can get beautiful significant data as well.
And yes, sir. And also, sir, in your this biomaterial, how it will trigger activated macrophage?
No, it doesn't treat the activated macrophages, but it's other way around. What happens like when you macrophages get activated, they release proteolytic enzymes, and those release proteolytic enzymes degrade your biomaterials to release the encapsulated drug. Say in this case, say an anti-inflammatory drug. So that will be released only when the macrophages get excited or activated, and this then drug will be released, and that suppresses the inflammation. So material doesn't do anything. Its material will act as a cargo or the delivery vehicle. So it responds to the inflammation and release the drug. And these drugs mechanisms and how they act as a anti-inflammatory agents, how they act as immunosuppressants have been it's well studied. That's why they have been approved for the clinical application.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, sir. Very interesting presentation. So I wanted to ask one question, like all the immunosuppressive drugs which like you were trying to deliver were all like specific, like for transplant patients here, you gave it to the area of transplantation. For rheumatoid arthritis, it was for knees. But when it comes to a disease like lupus, so which doesn't have a specific location as such, any organ can be affected. So what would be your strategy? Like how will you target a drug in such a disease? And one more question, like in the disease inflammatory bowel syndrome, you said like the biomaterial goes and fixes to the region where there is inflammation. So suppose we take a intestine and we divide it to 5 regions, A, B, C, D. So today it has inflammation in A and C. Next day it has inflammation in another 2 regions. So once we take the biomaterial, it goes and stays at 2 regions, but the other regions are devoid of our medicine. Like, so how will we like deal with such complications?
Okay, so yeah, I will answer your second question first. So in that case, right, it's not like that you are going to take only one dose administration and that's the entire therapeutic window, right? So you will be taking frequently. What we are doing is with this targeting material, you are not reducing the dose, right? Or reducing the frequency of taking, but rather you are increasing the chance of accumulation at the only site of inflammation. Say, for example, day 1, when you take, you have locations at C and D, you have inflammation. And when you take this medication, only these particles will bind to C and D regions. Okay, rest of them they excreted out, right? So if we say like later next day if inflammation is coming and parts regions A, so when you take your next dose, okay, that time particles are going to bind to only region A and rest of it will be excreted like that, right? It's not like a one time you take and that's the your therapy ends there, right? It's not. So whenever you take and at that particular time, like wherever the inflammation is there, it goes and binds and rest of it clears it off. And for your first question, yeah, the lupus is a very interesting one, right? Like right now I don't know exactly the answer for it, but I can give an indirect answer. For example, like we have shown that by using this inflammation targeting material, you could use for systemic inflammation as well. For example, we are using this urine bladder cystitis, okay? Because where the urine bladder when gets inflammation, there is no drugs remain there because they have very frequent urination and it's highly painful. And any drugs give today, the maximum residence time people have seen is 15 minutes, nothing else. But with this technology, when you give them like even systemic, it goes and binds there. Despite of such frequent urinations, we have shown that up to 24 hours, we can still see the presence of these particles. So that's why like we are thinking that like, even if it is systemic, as long as you have a way to administer there, they can bind it. And for the in terms of the lupus, I don't know because we need to see is there any special strategy one need to take it to do that? Because again, like each disease again one need to customize, right? It's going to be the case specific. As long as your basic platform technology, where is inflammation responsive and inflammation targeting, if these two are inherent property of the material, then rest of it you have to customize depend upon the particular disease what you are trying to treat. So then lupus one need to do a separate design as well according to that. But right now I don't know the answer. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions? Or?
Praveen,
Yeah.
I had a question for you. Basically, you have always given your technology to a startup or some other company. You have not thought about starting your own startup, or you have not explored the possibility of your students starting a startup. So is there a specific reason you opted for such a method?
No, actually, all our technologies we co-found the companies. In fact, we started 5 companies based on these technologies. These are not given to completely other companies which are established. No, these are we co-founded. We started the companies. Regarding the
So the
okay,
Boston one is also started by you? Boston?
yeah. In fact, those companies also we found from here. So,
Oh, okay. Why in Boston? Why the country outside India?
There are multiple reasons. One of the thing is like it's also the investment fundraising because those are medical basically it's a drug discovery companies is two, and which needs like in order of millions of dollars, like moving forward, like at least we need $100-200 million. Raising that quantity or that large investment in India for the discovery, little bit tough, I felt. So there for especially early stage discovery, investment is little bit easier or better, I would say, from US. That's one of the reason I started there. And also the expertise, like, for example, like we want to bring the people like for the dev to manage the company day-to-day operation, people who have been there, done that, like, went through this entire drug discovery pipeline, identifying them also. And since I also spent, like, 5 years at Harvard, like, I know some of the networks, I got connected with the networks there, so I could able to pull out some of the networks and able to build that. So those are the reasons. But for other companies, like, for the pesticide company or, like, or fabric company and all, so there relatively the investment is much lower, smaller amount we need. And also this problem is also very, like, for example, pesticide company and all, it's a more India centric problem. And I want to develop everything here, so that's why I started here. So that's why, like, one more thing is, for the, if you want to do the entrepreneurship, it's great to think about, like, our local stuff, we do this, but more than anything, one need to see what exactly technology demands, where it demands, how to, so a decision should be only based on that, rather than, like, because what is the point, like, if a company, if I can form somewhere else and can take to the next level within 2 years, but instead of that, if I do it somewhere else which can take like 4 or 5 years, so I might lose that entire window to develop fast. Because no matter where you develop, your IP is here, IP is your lab, IP is here from your institute, so that credit always there, and your end beneficiary anyway, like inventors and the institute are the end beneficiaries, right? Just because company is somewhere else doesn't mean that all the credit is gone, right? In fact, like, that is, in fact, I would say it's a great validation. You're developing entire IP from Bangalore, and, like, which is validated worldwide, and people are putting hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. So that's where, again, like, it's depend upon the technology, what it demands. That's the place we go and do it. So
Just a clarification, are you director of all of these companies, or you are only a consultant, or what is the role you play?
no, I am director as well, but, like, I take non-executive positions.
Yeah,
Because
that means you're not drawing money out of it. Yes, because of the conflict of interest kind of a situation.
That's
That is
right. In fact, like, Instem has set it up, this entire policies beautifully to enable this inventors to go and form the companies. And this conflict of interest is highly managed by the institute, and to make sure that we don't have any conflict of interest. So that paperwork is
correct. That's what I wanted people to understand, because these are small technical things which people do not understand how to go about doing it. So that's, I just wanted to get that perspective, because I'm aware of the process. So I just wanted, this question was leading to that.
No, in fact, that is a very valid point, because you see, if I'm a regular employee of an institute, if I'm planning to form any company, whether IP is related here or not, if I'm planning to form a company or planning to take an equity in a company, one has to, before doing that, one has to get a written permission from institute, and one needs to approach the institute and get permissions from them. Once they have the written permission, then only they can go and form the companies. And each institute, they have their policy set it up. So just contact either director or a tech transfer office to see what is the process and do it. But that has to be done, otherwise, like, it can lead to the huge complications later. Yeah. One must do. In fact, like, even for consultings, right? Like, because when you consult, also people, like, they have different modes of payment, either time in exchange of your time, people also can give shares and equities. But even to take that as well, one has to go through the institute and declare those conflicts and so on. So that has to be done, and it is possible for every institute to do that.
So I would really excited to see all the things which you have done. Amazing. You are an example for most of the people in biotechnology, how you should be planning and looking at things. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful talking to all of you. And more when I come to Trivandrum, we will discuss even more.
Yes, so please do let me know when you are there. So I would like to show you around, and
Sure.
many people may be willing to talk to you. Like I think Vinod was talking to you, and many others are there who would be interested in talking to you. Thanks. Parvat, you can take over.
Yes, sir. So if we don't have any further questions, we'll wind up the session. So for that, I have Vivek here who will deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of RGCB and Scientific Coordination Division, I extend my sincere thanks to our director, Professor Chandrabas Narayana, for guiding us with all support to arrange this kind of motivational webinar series to our staff and students. Thank you so much, sir. Only because of your support and encouragement, we were able to make this event what it was. I extend my sincere thanks to Dr. Praveen Kumar Vemula, Associate Professor in STEM, Bangalore, for kindly accepting our invitation to share the experience towards his journey as an academic entrepreneur and motivate our scientists and students towards translational research. Sir, your talk was really an inspiring and informative one. Today, we had an opportunity to hear your thoughts on developing prophylactic and therapeutic biomaterials for unmet clinical needs. And this will surely be going to encourage and motivate our young researchers in our future research and academic activities. Your thoughts have enlightened our minds and have shown us a new path. Thank you once again for spending your valuable time for us. I also thank our instrumentation division for making necessary arrangements for this talk. And finally, thanks to all staff of RGCB administration, faculties, and students who have actively attended to this talk and made today's event a resounding success. Once again, thank you all. We will be having another talk by Professor T. Pradeep, Department of Chemistry, IIT Madras, on October 13th, 2021, as part of this webinar series. We look forward to all of your active participations in this webinar series. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.